This was Henry VIII, a man who had once been called England's Golden Prince, a man who had broken the Roman Church in half, who had 6 wives, and moved history with the stroke of a quill, a man who beheaded friends, lovers, and clergy, and never once doubted that God was on his side. But God had gone quiet, and Henry was dying, rotting, in fact. And no one in the palace, not even the bravest, dared say it out loud. Once, he had been beautiful. Not just powerful dash, radiant, tall, broad, with curling, red-gold hair, a skilled jouster, a musician, scholar fluent in Latin, French, and theology. He danced, he sang, smiled with teeth that hadn't yet blackened. The people called him the ideal Renaissance king, and he believed them. "I am the second Solomon," he once said, "prince above all others." But beauty fades, glory corrodes, and kings are still made of flesh. 1536. A tournament in Greenwich, the king then, in his mid-40s, charged. Full force in shining armor. His horse buckled. He fell as the massive animal rolled over him. He was crushed, unconscious for hours. The court held its breath. Its doctors assumed he wouldn't survive. But Henry woke, and something inside him didn't. That day, a deep wound formed in his thigh. A wound that never healed. It ulcerated, festered, oozed every day for the rest of his life. It had to be drained with knives, hot cloths, and prayer. The stink was indescribable. The leg was rotting. Surgeons said the tissue was dying from within. The Pacello black thick-soaked the royal sheets. The stench filled every room he entered, but no one dared gag. No one dared flinch. Because the king's wrath was worse than the smell. He still signed death warrants with the same shaking hand. So the court bowed lower. The walls were perfumed, and the physicians lied. "You're recovering, Your Majesty." But they knew, and Henry knew, he was not healing. He was dissolving. By 1540, Henry VIII was no longer the Golden Prince. He was over 400 pounds. A mountain of bloated, sweating flesh. He couldn't walk unassisted. He had to be hoisted by ropes, pulleys, and guards onto his bed. The ulcers grew worse. He screamed during the drainings. Some nights, they said, he bit his own hand to keep from crying out. But it wasn't just his body that changed. His mind began to break. He grew paranoid. He saw betrayal in every face. He screamed at shadows, tore apart friendships with a single command, and still, they called him Majesty because they were too afraid not to. Whitehall was silent. Servants learned to walk without sound. Doctors bowed with trembling hands. No one said what they all knew. The king is dying, because to say the words out loud, even to whisper them, was treason. So instead, they talked of the weather, of falconry, silk shipments from France. While outside the king's chamber, the air hung heavy. Like waiting at the mouth of a tomb, inside he groaned, moaned, bled. He spoke names no one understood. Sometimes he laughed, sometimes he wept. One night, he shouted, "I am not dying, do you hear me? Cannot die." No one answered, because they all knew gods die. Worst of all, once, Henry had admired himself. He had rooms full of mirrors, portraits of his strong jaw, his brilliant clothes, his powerful legs, but in his final years, he ordered them removed. He couldn't bear the reflection. His face was swollen, his hair thin and gray, his eyes bloodshot, watery, cruel, his teeth black with rot, his legs oozing sores covered in wrappings and silk. One servant described him as a great swollen thing, moaning and steaming like a dying beast. And yet, he still called himself divine, still demanded obedience, still ruled. From the shadows of his own decay, the courtiers began to count the hours. The succession was unclear. His son Edward was a sickly boy of 9. The kingdom teetered on the edge of chaos, and yet no one dared say, "Let the king pass," because no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge the end, so they waited. As Henry VIII bled, as his sheets soaked with bile, as the leg rotted to the bone, they waited for the final gasp, the final decree. It's the final curse of a man who once ruled the world, and now couldn't lift his own head. Not truly. In that bed soaked with sweat and bleeding silk. Not in those walls where candlelight shook like frightened servants. Not in his dreams where the doors opened by themselves, and the dead returned. He ruled 6 queens. 2 he buried. 2 he banished. 2 he beheaded. And now in the final weeks of his life, they returned. Not in forgiveness. Not in flesh. But in silence, in dreams that felt too sharp to be dreams. In shadows that stood too still to be shadows, she came first. Jane Seymour, the 3rd wife, the only one who gave him what he wanted most, a son, and died for it. She died 12 days after giving birth to Edward, pale, fevered, torn apart inside. They wrapped her in linen, buried her quietly. But Henry mourned. He called her his true queen, had her painted beside him even after her death. Refused to speak of the others, and now she returned. She came at night, when the fire had died. When his wound pulsed and the room smelled of rotting skin, white gown. No footsteps. She did not cry. She did not accuse. She stood by the bed, watching. And Henry whispered, "Jane, stay. Please stay." But she never answered. She never moved. Then came the child bride, Catherine Howard, barely 17. A girl. With laughter like sunlight and perfume in her hair, he married her old, heavy, and wounded. She called him sweetheart. She danced for him. He gave her pearls, and when her secrets came out, her letters to younger lovers, her past he had ignored, he sent her to the block. She was dragged screaming from Hampton Court, begged to speak to him. She never got the chance. On the day she died, she asked for the block to be brought to her chamber, so she could practice laying her neck upon it. In Henry's dreams, she did it again and again. The blade never fell. She just lay there waiting. Sometimes she screamed. Sometimes she whispered, "I was a child." And once, in the dark, Henry screamed back. She came next, Anne Boleyn, the 2nd queen. The one who changed everything he had torn down. The entire Catholic world to marry her, called her his destiny, his passion, his new beginning. But when she gave him a daughter and not a son, he grew cold. He accused her of witchcraft, of incest, treason, and when she walked to the scaffold, on a gray May morning in 1536, she smiled. She looked beautiful, alive, defiant. Her last words, "God have mercy on my soul. To Jesus Christ I commend my spirit." Now she visited him. He never saw her face. Just the sound of footsteps, just a scent of roses where there were no flowers. And sometimes the sound of soft, mocking laughter. Anne had always laughed at him. Even at the end, especially at the end, there were others. Catherine of Aragon, his first queen, who died alone in exile. Still calling herself his wife. Catherine Parry's last queen, who nursed him with prayers and fear, knowing one wrong. Word could get her killed. Anne of Cleves, the quiet one who escaped with her head intact. Watching from a safe distance as the king devoured himself, Henry saw them all, in the folds of his curtains, in the gaps between candle flickers, in the breath he took and regretted. But it wasn't just ghosts, it was his body. The leg wound had turned black. Surgeons said the tissue was dying from within. He could barely be moved. Every shift tore. The skin, every breath was pain. He bled from places no one could speak of. He smelled like something already dead, could not eat, could not sleep, could not speak without sobbing. And when he closed his eyes, he saw the faces, the queens, the traitors, the martyrs. They watched me. He whispered it one night, to no one. "They're waiting for what?" they asked. He only smiled, for me to join them. He had rewritten the Bible. He had declared himself head of the church. Had built and burned England in his image. But now, no priest could help him. No confession could soothe him. No doctrine could protect him. The Pope had excommunicated him. Rome had cursed him. And in his mind, Henry saw what came next. Not heaven, not glory. fire that burned but never consumed, a throne of bone, and the sound of screaming wives. Forever in most kingdoms, the death of a king is followed by mourning bells, banners lowered to half-mast. But in England, in the winter of 1547, when Henry VIII began to slip into the dark, no one said a word. Not because they didn't know, because no one dared be the first. To speak the truth was to commit political suicide. To acknowledge that the king was dying was to admit that he was no longer king. And in Tudor England, that could cost you your head. At Henry's bedside stood powerful men, men who had survived executions, betrayals, religious wars, but now they tiptoed. The Duke of Norfolk, Edward, Seymour, Thomas Wriothesley, and others. Each of them had one thought: who comes next? Not in prayer, but in strategy. Because when a monarch falls, the court doesn't mourn. It calculates. Henry's only legitimate son was Edward, child of just 9 years, sickly, fragile, sheltered. Who would rule for him? A council, a protector, a war. Henry hadn't trusted anyone enough to make it simple. He had changed his will 5 times, signed it with a stamp, and left the door open to confusion, and in that confusion, the vultures. Circled, each nobleman in the palace hallway was already measuring his steps toward power, but none dared say, "The king is dead," because he wasn't dead yet. He was dying, slowly, rotting, but alive. And as long as he breathed, his wrath could still burn. Henry's physicians were some of the finest in Europe, and all of them were terrified. They treated the king with poultices, prayers, and polished lies. When asked for updates, they bowed and said, "He is resting. He is peaceful. He is ... improving." All of it was false. By now, the king was slipping in and out of consciousness. His leg had to be drained hourly. His skin turned yellow. His breath was shallow, wet, labored. And still, they kept silent, because to declare him dying was to risk being the first scapegoat if he awoke. So they waited, watched, and sweated behind their collars as Henry whispered to ghosts only he could see. Then came the night when it changed. Henry awoke, wild-eyed, confused. He tried to stand, screamed as his body refused to move, and then he bellowed, "You think I'm dead already, don't you? You want me gone? All of you?" Silence. No one moved. A servant fainted. A lord dropped to his knees. One courtier wept not from grief, but from pure, paralyzing fear. Henry thrashed. The linens tore beneath him. His ulcers burst, blood soaking the mattress, and finally his eyes rolled back. He fell unconscious. That night, entire palace went cold. For 3 days, Henry hovered between life and death. Clocks ticked. Candles burned to stubs. The stench of rot thickened. No food was served in the royal quarters. The queen's rooms were sealed, and still no announcement, because until the final breath left his body, no man dared speak. The throne was still occupied by a dying god in a bed soaked with pus and prophecy. They feared the afterlife. They feared Henry more. In the early hours of that morning, as a freezing fog rolled across the Thames, Henry VIII exhaled for the final time. No priest had been called. No crown rested at his bedside. Only silence. The king was dead, but still no bells rang. No announcement was made. They waited 3 more days before telling the world why. Because the power vacuum was dangerous. Because the factions had not yet agreed. Because they had to be sure that Henry was truly gone, that his ghost would not rise and punish them all. When they moved the body, they had to roll it into a massive lead-lined coffin. It took 6 men as it was carried toward St. George's Chapel. Something horrifying happened. The coffin began to leak. Blood. Black fluid. The rot of a king whose body had decayed faster than his soul. It dripped onto the church floor. A dog came forward and licked it. Witnesses would whisper for years that it was divine justice. A dog licking the blood of a king who had once licked the bones of martyrs. Kings are meant to be buried with glory. Processions, trumpets, golden sarcophagi. But when Henry VIII died, no songs were sung, no tears fell in public, and his body, bloated, leaking, grotesque, was sealed inside lead, as if England itself could not bear the smell of him. This was not the burial of a god, it was the containment of a monster. The doctors had begged them, do not delay the funeral. Henry's body was decomposing faster than they imagined. The ulcered leg had burst in his sleep. Internal organs were liquefying, his abdomen had bloated, his lips had blackened, and so his servants sealed him in a massive lead coffin. They poured quicklime inside, lined it with cloths soaked in herbs, and still it leaked. By the time the coffin was carried to St. George's Chapel, foul-smelling fluid was dripping from the seams. The royal pallbearers gagged behind black sleeves. No one dared speak aloud the truth. The king is rotting. From within, they say the body rested overnight at Sion Abbey on the journey to Windsor, and that there, in the quiet of the chapel, a horrible thing occurred. The coffin split. Dark fluid blood, bile, rots, spilled onto the floor. The air filled with stench, and then a dog entered. No one knew from where. Silent, gray, thin. It approached the coffin, lowered its head, and began to lap the blood of the king. No one moved. No one dared, because to speak was to name the omen. A beast licking the remains of a tyrant. A priest later whispered, "Even the hounds come to claim what justice will not." The story spread, and it never died. January 1547, the king who broke the church was buried in the very chapel of royal saints. No golden statues, no thunderous choir, just the scraping of boots, the echo of chains, and the lingering scent of death. His son Edward, Vi, too young to understand the weight of legacy, stood stiff and black, his face pale, his eyes hollow. Behind him nobles, each one calculating, each one waiting for what came next. Not one of them wept. Not one dared look down at the leaking coffin. They buried him beneath the floor of St. George's Chapel. No raised tomb, no towering sculpture, just a slab, no inscription, because no one could agree on what to say. Years later, his daughter Mary, Bloody Mary, would die and be buried. Elizabeth, his other daughter, would rise as the Virgin Queen. But Henry, he remained under stone. Forgotten, his tomb had never been completed. The golden effigies he planned were never cast. The marble canopy he ordered was never built. And over time, the spot beneath which his body lay collapsed, the ground beneath the chapel cracked, sank, the floor fractured. Masons covered it with fresh stone. Today, visitors walk over it. Unaware, they tread on the bones of the man who once ruled England like a god, but Henry didn't stay buried in memory. Stories began to spread. Palace servants whispered of a figure seen limping through the halls of Whitehall, dragging one leg. Reeking of sulfur, children claimed they saw a man in red velvet standing over the beds of sickly infants. Guards at Windsor refused to walk alone through the lower corridors near the chapel. They said the air turned sour. That voices echoed from beneath the stone. That sometimes, when no one was near, the floor grew warm. What did Henry leave behind? A boy king who died young, a kingdom torn between Protestants and Catholics, a country soaked in blood, split in soul, fractured in faith. He had broken the monasteries, burned the saints, beheaded queens, banished friends, and now he lay beneath cold stone, leaking into English soil. But his ghost, his reign, never truly ended. He once called himself the new Solomon, England's David, God's warrior prince. But at the end, Henry VIII died, not with a sword in hand, but with black blood on his sheets. Screaming into the dark, surrounded by shadows he himself had made. They say all kings must die, but some do not go quietly. When Henry VIII died, he left behind more than a throne. He left behind a kingdom split in two, a boy too young to rule, and a legacy soaked in blood. That boy was Edward. Vi, and the crown placed on his head, still wet from his father's rot. Edward was only 9, sickly, thin, raised in Tudor's arms in cloistered chambers. He had never commanded armies, never loved, never lived, but they called him king. Behind the scenes, men like Edward Seymour, his uncle, ruled in his name. And as protector, Seymour began what Henry had only begun: a full Protestant Reformation. Churches stripped, Latin abolished, altars smashed, monks banished. The boy was raised to believe his father was a hero, a prophet, second Moses. But Edward's eyes were always tired. Just 6 years after Henry's death, Edward VI died. 15 years old, skin sunken, coughing blood. Historians argue tuberculosis, poison, divine punishment. He wasted away in whispers. The court grew quiet again. Another Tudor gone, and with Edward's death, Henry's greatest fear returned: no male heir. All that blood spilled for a son, and now the crown passed to his daughters. Mary, I, Henry's daughter, by Catherine of Aragon, took the throne next. She had watched her mother cast out, watched the Catholic Church be burned by her fathers. Lust, watched the courtiers pretend they had always served truth. And now she would make them pay. She brought back the Latin Mass, the Pope, the monks, and then she lit the fires. Over 280 Protestants burned alive. Bishops, widows, farmers, children. England called her Bloody Mary. But in truth, she was her father's daughter. She ruled by fear, by divine command, by flame. And in her chambers, she kept a miniature portrait of Henry, his face golden, smiling false. Anne Boleyn's daughter, the child of the wife Henry had beheaded. She wore white, fused marriage, claimed she was wed to England alone. But those closest to her said she feared love. She feared her own blood. She feared becoming him. In court, she banned anyone from speaking of her mother, or of the Tower, or of the axe. But at night, she walked alone through Whitehall, pausing in the gallery where her father's portrait once hung. No one knew what she whispered there, but one servant claimed to hear her say, "I will not die as he did." Henry VIII had torn apart his country to build a legacy, but his dynasty did not survive. Edward died young. Mary died childless. Elizabeth died alone, and with her, the house of Tudor ended. No sons, no heirs, just silence. All that remained of Henry's dream was a cracked tomb and a cursed name. Years passed. Centuries turned. The stories never stopped. They say Whitehall is still haunted, that sometimes in the winter a figure can be seen massive, limping, breathing like a furnace, dragging one leg clad in velvet, face twisted in agony, eyes burning with guilt. He does not speak, he only watches, and where he walks, the candles flicker. The dogs whimper, and the air grows heavy with rot. Built by fear and died in pain. His throne could not save him. His wives could not heal him. His children could not carry him. And now he is legend, but not in glory or in warning, because some kings build empires, but others build their own graves. The story of Henry VIII does not end with his death. It lingers, like a wound that never healed, like a name whispered by those too afraid to speak it aloud, because kings may die. But the consequences of their reign, they echo far beyond the grave. Henry had once imagined a grand monument, gold statues, carved angels, a tower so high that the world would remember his power for eternity. He wrote letters, sketched plans, demanded marble from Italy. But after his death, no one built it. His body was buried under a plain black slab in St. George's Chapel. No epitaph, no sculpture, no monument. Why? Because no one truly wanted to remember him. Years passed, the stone beneath his tomb cracked, moisture rose from the ground. The structure weakened, and one day the floor gave way. It collapsed inward. Right where the coffin lay, workmen sealed it up quickly. No one spoke of it. They simply paved over the sunken ground. No repairs, no restoration, just silence. A king once worshipped as a god, now buried beneath a forgotten floor. Henry had destroyed everything to protect his bloodline. 6 wives, 2 beheadings, One break with the church, thousands executed, all to give England a son. But in the end, Edward VI died before reaching manhood. Mary I died childless. Elizabeth I never married. The house of Tudor ended, not with war, not with betrayal, but with silence. Henry's bloodline simply vanished in the centuries that followed. Henry's ghost never rested. Visitors to Windsor reported strange sounds from beneath the chapel floor, whispers in the night, scratches on the stone, a heavy scent of sweat and blood and ash. One priest claimed to hear chanting beneath the tomb. In no language he recognized, guards refused to patrol the chapel after midnight. Some swore they saw a figure massive, limping move across the back wall, dressed in velvet, eyes burning. They say he speaks no words, but leaves the air thick. With guilt to this day, Henry VIII remains one of the most famous monarchs in history, but not for his glory. Not for his wisdom, for his destruction, for the trail of bodies, the wives, the shattered churches, the children who grew up in fear of becoming him. He tried to rewrite God's law and died screaming into shadows. Henry VIII ruled by blood, built by fear, and died in pain. His throne could not save him. His wives could not heal him. His children could not carry him. And now he is legend, but not in glory. In warning, because some kings build empires, but others build their own graves.